Oh, lawyers. My brother's one, a really good one at that. And my fiance is considering looking into it herself, which I support. But not all lawyers are necessarily the most fastidious, if you will. In fact, I remember the night that Gwen and I both realized that there was something more than just a friendship brewing between the two of us. I came out and found her arguing with a lawyer who was just being a jerk, but just trying to stir things up with her, arguing whether or not he should use compost in his garden, and saying that he didn't have to and he shouldn't. And she was like, "Are you insane? Of course you do." And the rest of the night moved on. It was really funny, but especially the moment when I piped in and said, "Actually, compost is a good idea." And he said, "Oh, that's a no, Thor." I'm like, "Are you insulting me? Because if I look like Chris Hemsworth, I'm starting to look more like Fat Thor these days, but hey, I digress." And I said, "Hey, Gwen, you want to go over here and talk?" She's like, "Sure do." And we had a much more enjoyable conversation. I like the fact this kid, I'm guessing is a kid, a young guy, is kind of an upstart. Going like, "Well, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to ask you. What do you think?" And he gives, "Love God, love your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said, "Good job. Do this and you will live." Now, could he have ended right there and been just fine? Of course. But no. He had to go like, "Oh yeah? Well, who is my neighbor?" Thinking he's going to test him. Testing is the province of Satan. So obviously, Luke is not too fond of this lawyer in particular either. And Jesus starts out with a trope that people are expecting. The priest, the Levite, and the good Israelite, or the good Jew. But he switches it up and says the good Samaritan. And the lawyer is so frustrated that he can't wiggle his way out of this parable. But he can't even say the Samaritan was a neighbor. He says the one who showed him mercy. I can see him like, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, "Yeah, go and do likewise." Now, we've heard a lot of different things about the story of the Good Samaritan and about the priest and the Levite, how they were on their way to Jerusalem, so they couldn't afford to touch the body lest they become unclean. That's actually not true. Because in Judaism, in these stories, you always go up to Jerusalem and down from Jerusalem. Even if you're coming from higher elevations, Jerusalem is the centerpiece of the kingdom of Judea. It's where the temple is. It's where David set up his capital. And so everyone was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. So the reality is, the priest and the Levite in the story were more or less decent people who maybe a little bit classist. Guessing the priest was probably one of the Sadducees, so they were in cahoots with Rome. So the everyday people weren't really excited about them. So dismissing them as unwilling to help people, like, "Yeah, stick it to the man." Then the Levite who worked in the temple also walked past. So the people were like, "Yeah, these classist people, we're going to just undermine that." And Jesus was about to say what they expected, which was the good Israelite. So, the good, hard-working, salt-of-the-earth kind of person comes by and helps. But no, the sworn enemy after Rome of the Jewish people are the Samaritans. Now, this goes back hundreds of years, and I'm going to explore that a little bit today because I want you to get a better understanding of what that looks like. Pop quiz. What happened to the kingdom of Israel after Solomon died? Any ephemers remember? A split. Yeah, so the 10 of the tribes of Israel became the nation of Israel, and 2 of them became the nation of Judah. Well, that was, problematic along the ways. And up to the point of Amos's time, he's prophesying, that he's from Judah, but he's prophesying in Israel against the king of Israel. Super smooth, clean diplomacy, let me tell you. You can understand why the high priest was like, "You need to get out of here. If you want to prophesy, fine. Just go back to Judah where you belong." But Amos is like, "No, I'm not doing this professionally. I'm doing this because I feel called to do it. Now, what Amos was pointing to was what would happen when the kingdom of Babylon overthrew the kingdom of Israel, and people who were in high places were brought down low, killed, raped, pillaged, plundering, etc., etc. The few people left, few of the farmers, people like that. 100 years later, same thing happens to Judah. Now, after Assyria is overthrown by Persia, Cyrus decrees that, go back and build your temple. As long as you acknowledge me as king, you can have your religions and set it up and pay a tax, which is a great way of sourcing revenue through your colonies. Well, when Ezra and Nehemiah came back to build the temple, the Samaritans offered to help, but they said, absolutely not. You're not purebreeds. Because they had intermarried with other peoples of other cultures and other religions. So naturally they said, okay, well, we respect your differences and we'll let it be, right? Nope. It's like, oh, we're not good enough to help you rebuild your temple? Well, we're going to slow it down. And there's a constant bickering back and forth. But eventually, the high priest of Judea, after Ezra and Nehemiah set things back up, his grandson marries the daughter of the high priest in Samaria. It's very complicated. I promise we're going somewhere here. And decides, okay, well, fine, if you're going to be, and because he was not purebred, but still a worshiper of the God of Israel, Ezra and Nehemiah are like, absolutely not, you're out. And so, fine, we'll go make our own temple up in Gerizim. And so they build a temple in Samaria so that they can have their own place to worship. And that ultimately splits the nations even further. And that's where they begin to have animosity toward each other. When you get to the Hasmonean revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes, Hasmoneans destroy the temple at Mount Gerizim in Samaria. Real nice thing to do, but it's impure. And so the Samaritans go down and put dead bones of humans in the temple of Jerusalem to defile the temple. Now, why am I telling you all this information? Can you imagine at this point you're kind of in a Hatfields and McCoy's dynamic? Who really is good or bad in the situation? Both and neither. But nonetheless, you have this bitter animosity between brothers. They're really the same people, but this animosity is built up because of different ways of looking at things. Sound familiar? That's the challenge that I think that the Good Samaritan brings to us today, more than whether or not the priest and the Levite were good or bad people. What Jesus is forcing this upstart lawyer to look at is, what does it mean to be a child of God? What does it mean to follow the Torah? Does it mean, like Ezra and Nehemiah said, where you have to be a pure-blooded true Jew coming back from Babylon because the only real Jews are the ones coming back? Or you begin to recognize that the one who follows the Torah, the one who loves God with all their being and loves their neighbor as themselves, is the one who is the true child of God. Well, fast forward to the 21st century. Who's harder to love? Your oppressive enemy or your sibling who you felt betrayed you and your family? This is the challenge that Jesus is putting forward with this lawyer. We need to quit thinking that because we have offended one another so much that we're sworn enemies or our families are split in half. We need to think about broader things. As I remember a quote once said, the problem with our country is not the bigness of our country, it's the smallness of our politics. And I think that applies very well to what Jesus was trying to articulate here. Who is the hardest person for you to love today? Who is the hardest person for me to love today? But more important, and how do we remember that when we hate that person, and all of us have felt hatred, what do we do with that? Are we going to be a neighbor or an enemy to that person? That's usually the storyline that comes out of this, and it's true. But I want to focus a little further. Jesus was not talking about who's better or who's worse, who's friend or who's enemy. He's asking, who was the neighbor, this man in need? Did it matter where that person came from? Did it matter their political affiliation? Did it matter their citizenship status? Did it matter whether or not they thought that they had the right answer about God? No. It was a person who acted in accordance with the law of love. Keep in mind, remember when Jesus met the woman at the well in John's Gospel? What was she? Samaritan. Yes. Jesus refused to follow those lines. He said, that's it. We're going to start working together. And in that gospel, he talks about, y'all worship at Mount Gerizim, we worship in Jerusalem, but in time, all of us will worship God in spirit and in truth, and it will not matter where we worship. Does that diminish the holy places? No. But it reminds us that a place is holy, but the people's lived covenantal relationship is the holy of holies, if you will. So the refreshing challenge that Jesus brings to my mind today in my own life is how hard it is for me to recognize that sometimes I want my confirmation bias to be reinforced. Confirmation bias meaning you look for things to reinforce what you already think. And that's what this lawyer was looking for. What Jesus is trying to help us understand is look for the children of God in their lives, in their actions, and how they live. And that person may be the person you think is your worst enemy, or the one that threatens everything that you stand for. My self-righteous self doesn't like that because I like to be right. I like to go, aha, gotcha. But God is saying, focus on what it means to live that out and stop deciding who's in and who's out. And focus on how we coordinate with people from different groups, whether or not we like them, to ensure that we are living out neighborhoodness. After all, that is what we are. So the old love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. Today's piece is asking us to remember what it means to be neighborly, what it means to be a neighbor to ourselves and to others, and to ensure that when we really don't want to be neighborly to people, we are being reminded that we are called to be neighborly to them, even when they are not neighborly to us. And to remember that we have nothing about which to feel self-righteous ever. Because nobody's perfect, nobody's pure evil. Everyone has a balance. So may we be the neighbors that we want others to be. May we recognize the neighborliness in those who we would normally consider enemies. And may we hold one another accountable across those lines like Amos did, and Jesus, to ensure that we follow the law of love, which is what God has given us, over any sort of ideological or personal identities that we hold, and build that kingdom together where we are all in one big neighborhood. Amen.